Before we begin, we would like to acknowledge Johnny Forellis for editing and producing this content. Johnny runs a YouTube channel called The Lone Chemist, on which he provides commentary on film, music, media, politics, and anything else he finds interesting, using the formats of live podcasts, film and album reviews, and video essays, all from the analytical point of view of a chemistry graduate student. Please go to his channel at youtube.com/thelonechemist to watch his content again and let him know what you'd like to see covered next. Again, youtube.com/thelonechemist. Welcome to our Faces of Science interview. My name is Zach, and I'm a member of Northwestern Building on Diversity, better known as NUBonD. We are a graduate student-led organization within the chemistry department at Northwestern, whose primary goal is to foster a community built on inclusivity and diversity. Scientists often have many chances to showcase their scientific work, but rarely do we have the opportunity to learn about the person behind their scientific interests. For our Faces of Science interview today, we are thrilled to have Professor Richmond Sarpong from the University of California, Berkeley. Thank you, Professor Sarpong, for joining us and giving us the opportunity to get to know you. To get started, could you tell us a little bit about yourself and your background, Richmond?
All right. So first of all, it's a real pleasure to be here and
Yes,
to have this opportunity to share with you a little bit of my insights on various topics. So I was born in Ghana in West Africa, in the central region of the country, and by virtue of my parents' careers, moved around quite a bit. So even within Ghana, we moved up to the northern portion of the country, which was very much more rural and also had a different tribal makeup from the central region where I'm from, and lived there up until I was about 7 years old, between 6 and 7. At that point, there was a coup in the country, and this was around the time in Africa where there were lots of coup d'états in different countries, and so my father was part of the government, and so we left the country and moved to Zambia, and lived there for 2.5 years, and then moved to Botswana. And it was really in Botswana that I sort of had my formative years, went to high school in Botswana, and ultimately left Botswana for college in Minnesota in the United States, and went to a school called Macalester College, and then ultimately went to graduate school at Princeton University, and then postdoc at Caltech, and then started an academic career at Berkeley. So that's sort of a long introduction to myself, but it gives you a sense for my background.
The long journey that you've taken.
That's right.
What was the transition like going from Botswana to Macalester?
Right. So in Botswana, I actually went to 2 different schools. I went to sort of a more local, what is called a secondary school, and that's where I did my O-levels, which is the Cambridge system. This is the British system of education. So I did what's called the O-levels. And then because I didn't speak the local language, I went to an international school, and that's where I did what is called the A-levels, which is the advanced levels, and I took, math, physics, and chemistry during that time. But this was the American school. The international school is the American school, and so I got exposed to a lot of American culture.
Okay.
And so, I became familiar, of course, with MTV and everything that it had to offer, and all the other sort of Americanisms and slices of, Americana, The Simpsons, and everything else. So I had a sense for America before actually coming to the United States. But I have to say that Macalester College, which is where I went, was a very different America. This Macalester is sort of known as one of the granola havens of the U.S., and I don't know if you're aware of that. And so I showed up in August of 1991, and all the boys had long hair and all the girls had short hair, and it was a crazy introduction to. Sort of the liberalness of Minnesota.
Yes, for sure.
But it was a transition that came pretty naturally because the school was very international, and they made sure that all the folks that came in were transitioned in very easily. The other sort of transition I had to make was weather-wise, because I remember coming in. I watched a National Geographic show before I came with my mom, and it was talking about Minnesota. And it showed all the snow and everything else. And so I came in with just like flannel shirts, long pants, and I showed up August of 1991.
Oh, no.
It was super warm.
No.
It was like 88 Fahrenheit,
Yeah.
90% humidity or something crazy like that. So I had to quickly run to the student union store and buy a pair of shorts. But that was my introduction to Macalester.
Wow, great. Where along this path did you really spark interest in chemistry?
Well, so I've always been interested in chemistry, and really, I would say the real indelible image in my mind of when I really glommed onto chemistry was probably when I was 5 or 6 years old. So my father had an MD PhD, and chemistry was always his favorite subject, and so he would always mention sort of chemical things along with the sort of medical things that he talked about. But it was really hearing about this disease called river blindness, which really afflicted a number of people in West Africa. And it was a huge problem. And then there was this movement by the World Health Organization in collaboration with Merck Pharmaceuticals, and they started a sort of an initiative called ONCO, which is short for onchocerciasis, which is the name of the river blindness disease. And they came into West Africa and really helped essentially curb this affliction. And so that made a huge impression on me. It got me really curious about what the drug was that was able to help people overcome this sort of river blindness challenge, and that got me really interested in chemistry because I could tell it was all based on these molecules, and specifically organic chemistry. It was a compound called ivermectin, which became a really important drug to address not only river blindness but other parasitic diseases, including elephantiasis and several other crazy diseases that you find in developing countries in warm climates.
Yeah.
And as we contend with global warming, you never know. These are diseases that we might be facing even here in the United States someday.
Yeah, it's so critical, the work that organic chemists do for solving these issues like globally. Do you think, did you like interface with like chemists ever like growing up or in high school, or did you really kind of get more introduced to what that meant when you were in college?
I did. In fact, I remember very well my chemistry teacher early on when I was probably 14 years old or so.
Yeah.
And his name was Mr. Lefford. And Mr. Lefford was a Peace Corps volunteer who was in Botswana, spent a couple of years there, and taught chemistry.
Oh, nice.
And I remember him in a frustrated way trying to teach me what a mole was, and I had no idea what a mole was, and I just didn't grasp his concept. And I kept quizzing him. Okay, so if you have 1 mole of like sodium, what does that equate to in terms of grams? And he was like 23, and he just knew it all, and I was just like, wow, this guy's amazing.
Yeah.
And so that's really when I really started to like chemistry. And there was another kid in the class that was just like a whiz at chemistry. This guy Obadiah, and I always like try to emulate him. But that's when I really got interested in chemistry. And then when I started my A levels, there was a chemistry teacher, Dr. Ramakrishna, who had a PhD in chemistry, and she was incredible. But one of the things that she forced us to do was to actually teach a lecture in high school. We had to each teach a lecture, and I chose to teach a lecture on stoichiometry and molarity and everything else. And so that actually gave me a lot of confidence, that particular lecture, because my classmates afterwards just sort of remarked at how clear and how well presented the lecture was, and how it helped them understand the content. And so that really gave me a lot of confidence in knowing that perhaps I could be a good teacher.
Yeah.
And my mother was a grade school teacher, so I'd always, in fact, she was my teacher at one point, maybe in 3rd grade, and that was awkward. But yeah. Anyway, so that's probably the Mr. Lefford experience is what I remember clearly about chemistry, and really thinking that might be something I want to do.
Yeah, that's great.
And I should tell you, I followed Mr. Lefford's career, and so he's actually now a doctor in Seattle somewhere.
Oh,
yeah. Anyway.
Nice.
Yeah,
Oh yeah.
whatever that's worth.
Because you said
he came back. He came
Peace
back to the
Corps,
United States. Yeah, exactly.
Nice.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's cool to see that every step along the way, it's kind of building up to what you've become.
Right. I would have never predicted it, by the way, because frankly and honestly, I always thought I would be a medical doctor. Even though I was interested in chemistry, like similar to my father, who was interested in chemistry and still became a medical doctor. That's sort of what I thought would happen. But I think the real turning point to sort of organic chemistry and thinking about a faculty position happened in college. And so in my second year of college, I was fortunate to meet Rebecca Hoy at Macalester. She was an assistant professor, so it was interesting. So she had actually raised a family and then essentially went back and finished her PhD. And so she started as an assistant professor probably into when she was in her 40s, which is sort of unusual. But she came to Macalester, and I was in the first cohort of students to join her group, and she was very, very encouraging. Also really sparked an interest in organic chemistry. And at that stage, I thought, I might want to do organic chemistry solely and not medical school. And so I sort of changed from a pre-med focus to a chemistry focus.
Yeah, I feel like Orgo does that for some people, where it really sparks that interest.
It can. I remember my first semester of organic chemistry. So actually, I skipped several chemistry courses in college because with the A levels, which is what I did in high school, you could sort of place out of general chemistry. And sometimes I sort of regret that because I think there's some aspects of general chemistry that I probably should have relearned. But I skipped into the sort of more advanced courses. And so the first semester of organic chemistry was actually a bit of a struggle at the beginning. And I remember Janet Carlson was my professor at Macalester. And she was very encouraging. She was very nice. But I just thought there was a lot that I needed to absorb. And things really gelled toward the end of the semester with the final exams. And so I kind of escaped the first semester of Orgo. But yeah, so it's kind of gelled. The second semester was much more, in my wheelhouse. I loved carbonyl chemistry, and there was a lot of that. And so I think it really came together in the second semester for me. But the first semester was sort of putting all the pieces in place to sort of learn about reactivity for all the different functional groups, and that involved a little bit of memorization and sort of just knowing things.
Yeah, you need some of that definitely at the beginning. How some of those experiences shaped how you teach now? Because you said you teach at least once a semester, or
right.
Semester
Yeah, I do teach one course in a semester at Berkeley, and I what has really shaped my way of teaching from when I was in college is just really having patience with students and understanding that even though something might come naturally to me, it's a new experience and a new learning environment for the students. And so I think part of the teaching obviously happens when you're lecturing in terms of passing on information, but I think a lot of it also, in my case, I think happens in problem solving sessions and office hours. And my approach is to actually, when a student asks a question, is to have them teach and to try to answer that question. And this goes back to my experience in high school, where Dr. Ramakrishna had me go and teach a lecture to the class. And so I think a lot of times people really absorb and really have a good understanding of something if they're able to convey that back to others. And so I think I really like the idea of sort of a problem sort of based learning and having students sort of work through a problem and try to explain the answer to others as a way of learning.
Yeah, and I think that also builds up a lot of confidence in the students.
Yes, absolutely.
And
absolutely.
And also there's a lot of literature out there about having, both the lecture style is good to just get the information across, but the smaller group style and building up, people teaching it on their own is creating a more equitable environment, that there's many different ways in which people learn, and sometimes that's from the different cultural backgrounds where people come from, and so I think that's critical to meet them from different directions. Agreed.
Yeah. And I think not one style, as you said, works for everybody, but I think certainly there's something to be said for having sort of an intimate group setting where people feel safe and comfortable to be able to ask questions, but also to be able to contribute an answer, because if you feel like you're contributing, that certainly brings in a sort of level of inclusivity, and also provides an opportunity for others to potentially help clear up, some misconceptions or so forth in terms of the content, if you don't quite get it right, but you still feel like you're contributing to ultimately the group dynamic. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah, we're gonna. So now let's kind of maybe have a bigger picture. I'm gonna ask one of the big questions.
Go for it.
Why is diversity important in the natural sciences?
Well, I think so one of the analogies that I always make is actually to what I do, which are natural products, and so. Yes. Natural products are super diverse in terms of the types of molecules that you have. Mm-hmm. And that diversity really enables nature to be able to capture a diverse set of functions. Mm-hmm. And so in any community, in any living organism, there are different types of functions. Yeah. And you really want to be able to have access to all the different types of function. And so through diversity in people, in backgrounds, in experiences, you will be able to then capture all the different types of functions that you need in any functioning system. And so I think diversity is important in every aspect of what we do, in every aspect of life, because you will be able to capture different roles for people. People serve different functions that enables a whole ecosystem to work.
Exactly.
And so that's a very broad strokes general statement, but I think it's one that often I think people can identify with, because we just need to be able to have different perspectives, different roles, and people serve different functions. And so I think through diversity, we're able to capture these things that ultimately enable us to solve problems in a more effective way when they arise.
Yeah, and in a lot of places that's possible, but it's, in some places it's definitely not. Have you encountered any major barriers or adversary that's kind of going against that, valuing of diversity?
Right. So, I grew up, as I said, in Africa, but, even within in Africa, where things might seem very homogeneous in terms of people, there's actually quite a bit of diversity, and you'd be surprised and how people value it or don't value it. And so, for the most part, I was a foreigner in the countries that I lived in, and so I was an outsider, and people had their cliques and so forth. But I think I always approached things in a way where I was welcoming and also outgoing, and it forced me to be outgoing and so forth. And so I was able to essentially integrate into different communities, but never the same community. Even though some of the communities might have been somewhat homogeneous, I was able to integrate. Now, Botswana, at the time that I lived there, obviously it borders South Africa, and South Africa was still in apartheid. Yeah. Okay. And so there was a clear example of where people really did not want to integrate. And so there was, different communities. There were the Anglos, there were the Boers, there were, the Africans, there were, crazy things that you would never imagine. There were Indians, there were coloreds, there were, it's amazing, the sort of landscape that you had there. And I think that obviously set South Africa back quite substantially, because this was not supported by the rest of the world, and so it made it a little bit insular, and there was some level of insular thinking. But I think, in my opinion, if you're not open to the outside and protective, then you become a bit of insular thinking, and it could be positive for a while, but I think in the long run it's a very myopic view on things, and one needs to be very open globally.
Yes, that's interesting to hear that kind of perspective. And then coming to the U.S., how did you see the landscape of the U.S., the diversity issues in the U.S. kind of? What were some similarities? What did you find, more challenging or more eye-opening? Or
it's a good question, and I have to say that, the United States, one of the things that has surprised me the most
Yeah.
is that, I'm from Africa, and so, I'm black. But there are some differences between Africans and African Americans.
Yes.
And in fact, I would say when I first came to the United States, I felt like I had a lot in common with a lot more perhaps in common with students that were not African American, but students that were international students from other countries. So, for example, from China, from India, from one of my really close friends as an undergrad was from Turkey.
Yeah.
And he's actually now on the faculty at UCSD in chemistry as well.
Yeah.
His name is Akif Tezcan. He was a very close friend in college, and I think, it was sort of a mentality. It wasn't necessarily just your outward appearance. It was more about a mentality and how you approach things.
Yeah.
And certainly, I think as a sort of first generation type, I felt that there was a bit of a difference in terms of how I approached things from, I would say, a lot of my really close friends, too, that were African American, that maybe had a slightly different approach to sort of thinking about school and careers and so forth. So that was probably the one thing that surprised me the most.
Yeah, I mean, it really speaks to the multitude of identities that each individual can have.
That's right.
On the surface, you just think along racial lines or gender lines.
But it's actually quite different. And the other thing that threw a lot of people off is that my accent was sort of American, but not really. But people thought, oh, maybe he's from the West Indies or something, But I think sort of knee-jerk reaction is like, oh, African American, and then people start to talk to you and they're like, oh, actually, this guy's probably more in common with like kids from India or like from China or something like that. So
how is this kind of range of perspectives and experiences with diversity influence how you manage your research lab and your graduate students?
I think one of the things that I've learned is that you have to treat everybody fairly, but perhaps treating everybody fairly doesn't mean you treat everybody equally, which sounds weird, but I think I always look to treat everybody fairly and with respect, but there are cultural differences with people, and so I try to minimize, especially to be inclusive, try to minimize sort of the sort of bombastic English words or use of idiomatic English. In a group where we have folks from Japan, from other countries where English is maybe their second or third language, right? And so I think for that reason, a lot of people in my group have found it to be a very welcoming place because they feel like they can be part of conversations and don't necessarily feel left out. And so that's very important to me, to always have people feel included.
Yes.
And perhaps sometimes I go too far in that regard. So I'll give you an example. So usually my group has a get together in my house, and one of the things that we do is we do karaoke. And I have some shy students, and not everybody necessarily wants to do it. And sometimes maybe I go a little too far in trying to bring people into the fold to sing a song or something like that. But my knee-jerk reaction is always to have people feel comfortable and included. Because I still remember back to, as I mentioned, growing up where I was an expatriate, meaning from outside of a country, and always trying to make an effort to feel included and try to be included. So I'm very sensitive to that, and I really try to create an environment that's welcoming and inclusive to everybody. And as we talked about, the outward appearance is not everything. Even you can't generalize even in terms of international students or particular countries and so forth, because everybody's an individual. And I also try to get to know people a little bit beyond them just being students. So try to know their backgrounds, try to learn a little bit about their families and where they're coming from, because you'd be super surprised what you will learn about people and the struggles that they've been through, and down to a person, everybody's had their own struggles. So try to get an appreciation of that and be sensitive to that.
And in many ways, that's only just going to enhance the science, having that, understanding of each other and understanding of your group. It's, some people view it as a distraction or, unnecessary details, but I think it can only make that communication stronger when trying to figure out problems.
Absolutely, because the science, is done by people, and a lot of times the major discoveries that are made because people's personalities and the experiences, do tip the scales, because somebody might be stubborn in a particular way of focusing on something and that others don't believe in, and for some reason that could lead to a great success or a failure, which in turn might then catapult the next success, right?
Exactly.
So I think it's important. I think I view it as my greatest legacy, actually, as the people that I interact with, and if I can help shape their existence in any positive way, I think that would be my greatest legacy, more so than the next reaction or the next natural product that we make or something like that. I think your greatest legacy is really the people that you interact with and the people that you influence in some way.
Well, yeah, that leads me to another question I had. Have you had an example of a student who came in that was sort of struggling or sort of had to get, kind of acclimated to the environment and really turned out to be a really great success story that, as you said, can be really proud of?
Yes, I do. I have several examples, actually, and I'll start with perhaps my favorite one, which is a student that came from a university that was not sort of the traditional powerhouse, university for research or anything of that sort. And in fact, in terms of admitting the student to Berkeley, we do it by committee. And there was a lot of discussion about whether this person would thrive, right? So admission is not necessarily only about somebody getting into a program, but it's also about, will they be successful if they're here?
Yeah.
And based on the student's track record, they demonstrate success all along the way through high school to college, perfect 4.0 from, granted a university that was not a traditional powerhouse.
Yeah.
And so the chemistry GREs were very, very weak, okay? And so, one had to weigh that against all the other factors.
Yes.
So I made the case and advocated for their admission to Berkeley. And this student arrived at Berkeley and struggled through classes, struggled with organization, struggled with how they approached research for the first year, and they joined my lab. Okay?
Yeah.
And I would meet with a student, and I was brutally honest and just said, look, you have the capability to do extremely well, and you... Okay, forget any excuses from, that you didn't go to university like other students did or so forth and so, or college. You've now been here for, 8 months or whatever it was at that stage.
Yeah.
You know what the bar is here. I believe in you, and I know you have every capability to do what it takes to be super successful here.
Yes.
So show me what you can do. And I was very honest with this student. And I think they clearly identified with me.
Yeah.
And this student went on to be amazing. So turned it around. First started small with being organized in the lab, and then really taking an interest in the subject area, reading, and doing the hard work outside of lab to read the literature, read textbooks, and catch up and working with me. And this student is one of the best students that I've had. Okay, Nature science papers.
Oh my
it's
goodness.
incredible. So it's been a real pleasure to watch the development of this particular student.
That is great to hear.
Yeah.
And I feel like that's so impactful for people when you have such a huge advocate, and that being an advocate doesn't mean like just being, oh, you're great. You have to say, hey, you're not necessarily great right now.
That's right.
But you have
That's
the potential to be.
That's right. And that's such a hard thing to do. And I think it really has to be somebody that's invested in you to be able to tell you that, right? Because that's a hard thing to hear. And so I think, feedback is one of the things that I really, truly believe in.
Yes.
But I think it has to be somebody really invested in you to say, I know you're capable of this, but right now we are not there, and we need to address this particular challenge. Yeah. And it has to be constant. It doesn't have to be nagging, but it has to be constant and specific in terms of what areas need to be improved and so forth. And so that's, to me, that's been a joy to be able to have coworkers that have responded well to that as well.
Could you, so I think this leads to, could you discuss some of your mentoring style and how you run your group? You mentioned this feedback thing. I think we talked about yesterday a little bit.
Right. Yeah, so I'm very much, a person that likes to address things as soon as possible and also to set expectations clearly. Yeah. So the expectations might be high, but I also hope that I think we provide the environment and the tools to be able to meet those expectations. Yeah. And I tell my students, like, look, where we are at Berkeley is, it's an environment where the expectations are high, but we try to provide the environment and the tools to be able to meet those expectations. And so when people join my group, I make the expectations immediately very clear. And so, in fact, in my lab, when you arrive, you get what we called the blue book. It's now electronic, so it's not a blue book anymore. But you get a book, and it basically outlines a sort of standard operating protocol, the guidelines for how to conduct yourself in my lab. Okay. And so the expectations are very clear. And I also include in that book sort of how I write a recommendation letter. So what are the 10 points that I talk about in my recommendation letter? Yeah. And so if you want to be successful in this group and you're meeting these criteria, you're going to be in position to get a great recommendation letter. And so people at the very outset clearly know what my my expectations are. Yeah. And then I also meet with my students more recently, not as much as I would want to because I've had a lot of travel, but I try to meet with the students personally, maybe once every 2 weeks. And then in the alternate weeks, we have subgroup meetings. So they're still in a subgroup with me and getting feedback from me. Yeah. And so at least I try to have those prescribed meetings. But in addition to that, I also try to have what are more organic meetings. So I try to go into the laboratory and actually talk to people when they're at their hoods or at their desks. And I find that those are some of the very best and most productive conversations because, I don't know, maybe people are more at ease or it's much more sort of organic, but we find that a lot of nonlinear thinking happens then, and we come up with interesting solutions to the types of challenges that we might be having with our research. So, but I try to have these prescribed meetings, so there's definitely a set interaction times, and then we also have these sort of informal interactions. So I think what I try to convey is that I'm supportive of my coworkers, but also make it clearer than what the expectations are. And if I think they are not meeting those expectations, make that clear earlier than later. Yes. And then also try to get feedback from them as to how I'm doing. So, and that's always interesting because not everybody, some people are very blunt. And I remember in my first class of students, I had 4 graduate students that joined my group the first year, and those students were super blunt about like things that they thought I could do better and things that I should be doing better, and they would do it in person in my face. But it's interesting, and I loved that because I think that was good because we all grew from that. But the more recent students, I think some of them tend to be very subtle, and so I've asked and I've begged and I've cajoled for people to either write things down, type it up, slip it under my door. You can cut out letters from magazines and paste them on a piece of paper.
Like a ransom note.
Like a ransom note or something, like whatever it takes to maintain that anonymity. Do it and let me know what's going on, because I really always want to improve and I always want to get better, and I think we can always all of us have ways in which we can improve and get better as situations evolve and so forth. So that's my mentoring style is to be very open. And I think actually one of the things that I've really improved at, in my opinion, over the years is that I've learned how to be vulnerable and to let people know that I don't have all the answers and that we can figure it out together. And I think when I started as an assistant professor, and I apologize to my first group of students, I think there was this sort of like insecurity of trying to always have the answers and always think I know what I'm doing, which when I didn't always know what I was doing. And it was actually when you were super honest about what it is that you know and what it is that you don't know that you need to figure out together, that you can actually be even more effective and achieve really great things. And so
Yeah.
I think I'm much more comfortable to do that now, but it's a natural evolution because I think we've had some successes, and so you can be comfortable showing those vulnerabilities now because you can still sit back and land on the successes that you've had, right?
Yeah,
Whereas early on we didn't have anything, and so you had to build a bit of a foundation. So so I think honesty and approaching feedback and taking feedback with honesty is really important, and then addressing all situations early. I think has worked well for me with my group, and so in that way I think it helps me become more consistent. And so I mentioned this idea that I treat people fairly, but perhaps maybe not equally, and maybe that's not well stated, but I think I'm consistent in terms of how I interact and treat everybody in my group. And I think for a lot of the students that's important because I think students get a little bit unnerved when they can't predict how you might react to a particular thing and so forth. And so the sort of consistency in knowing, okay, and having the expectations clearly laid out has been important.
Yeah, you both need that structure, but you also have to meet the needs of individual students. So
that's right.
That balance.
Yeah, so that's what perhaps that's what I mean by like not equal, because every student has different needs, and so you have to treat people a little bit differently in order for them to meet the needs that they have.
But still reach the high standards that
absolutely,
you need in your lab
absolutely,
in Berkeley.
So some people get the tough talk about, we got to pick it up and we got to meet this high standard, and others are burning, the candle on both ends too much, and sort of like, let's dial it down a little bit and let's get perspective and let's find balance. And so that's what I mean. So everybody's it's a bit of a different, depends.
That's great to hear about your lab. Is there things at Berkeley, like department-wide, that people are trying to implement so that you see that inclusivity amongst all labs or amongst the department as a whole?
Yeah, so actually one of the things that we've been looking to do in our department is develop, so my group, I mentioned, I have these sort of perhaps once every semester sort of sit down feedback sort of thing that I do with my students. And there's a series of questions that I will ask, and about immediate goals, long-term goals, and so forth. And there's several other groups that do this as well, and it's a bit ad hoc. And so I've been talking with the chair of our department and trying to find a way in which maybe we can standardize something that every group can actually use. So every faculty member can do this with their own group in terms of doing the sort of meeting to talk about goals and so forth. And so it's not been implemented yet. I think it existed in the past, actually, because I think my colleague, I got some examples from my colleague Bob Bergman, and more recently, my colleague Matt Francis and I have been talking about this idea. So so I think in the past it happened, and then obviously with faculty turnover and people retiring and so forth, these things wane, and then we'll try and build it up again. So I think there's a way in which we can create a document that would be included in sort of the graduate student handbook and things like that. So so I think there are opportunities to do this at a larger level. Go ahead.
I think that's really important to just make sure, because there are a lot of differences between labs, and that's good for people. People need to search and find what's a good fit, but there are certain standards and techniques that I think should apply to every group, and department-wide, and these setting out these guidelines and expectations. It's a little bit more hidden at times, or understated. Being explicit.
Being
really
explicit,
helps.
I think, is very important. I think students, and at least in my group, have been very appreciative to know sort of what my expectations are right off the bat. And maybe it works for them, maybe it doesn't, and you can find an environment where the expectations there work. But I think that's often the source of unnecessary stress, is sort of not having an understanding of what the expectations are. And sometimes it has to be reinforced, on a more regular basis. But I think, to me, that's always been the thing that I like to do, and I think it avoids a lot of complications. Going back to your question, one of the other things that I think our department, and actually our college at Berkeley, is doing very well is really trying to address sort of mental health among our graduate students. So we've seen a lot of challenges for a lot of students. And it's not surprising because if you look at our community at large, okay, and you take a cross-section of any community, mental health is a real concern. And so, in fact, in our college, we have now a resident psychologist from the University Health Center that's actually has an office in our college.
Wow.
And so the students have access to a resident psychologist within the College of Chemistry because we did see a fair number of students, both graduate students and undergraduates, postdocs, and even staff that did have, challenges in terms of mental health. And so this is something that we looked to address, pretty much in a very real way.
No, I think that is critical. That was actually going to be my next question about mental health. I'm glad you brought that up. Because how large is the college at Berkeley? It's one of the largest.
It's
right?
we have between 400 and 500 graduate students, and maybe half that number of postdocs, so maybe 200 to 250 postdocs. And then in terms of undergraduates, it's hard for me to pinpoint exactly, but maybe 600 undergrads that are in the College of Chemistry. And so it's a fairly large, almost between 15 and 2,000 individuals that are sort of associated with the college.
And having
so it's a large number.
At least one person dedicated to that is a huge step compared to how other programs handle that. I think having someone who is dedicated to that, section of students and can maybe start getting an understanding of that environment.
Absolutely.
For students can be really beneficial.
Absolutely. Yeah. And so this is an investment on the part of the college, and I think it's actually been a very good investment, which benefits students obviously, but also staff and I think people are really moving away from this sort of stigma of sort of talking about mental health, and I think that's important because it is a disease, and it is something that can be treated, and the first step is obviously to start to address that.
And approaching it from that standpoint rather than just like a deficit or weakness in someone. I think that's we're seeing that more and more nowadays, especially with some of these studies that came out of, I think, the Netherlands that were showing, over 30% of like graduate students in this one program in Netherlands had seen a therapist or had depression or something.
No, it certainly makes sense, right? Because that's a stressful environment, and I think a lot of these issues also, especially in your 20s and early 30s, I think a lot of things are exacerbated for a lot of people in terms of finding out who they are, finding out themselves. And obviously in this environment where the expectations are high, and you're surrounded by, others that are just as talented as you are, and there are challenges, I can see how, that's a real thing. And for a lot of people, finding the community and the support is an important part of that. So it has to be addressed, and it can't be just swept under the rug. And I think the old sort of ideas about, just toughen it out, and, graduate school used to be a certain way. And I think all those things are really changing.
Yes, exactly.
And I think for the better.
I think it's really important to have that professional help, but also, as you were discussing earlier, understanding the whole person. Even if you're not talking about all those things that can be very personal for some people, just having an appreciation and wanting to know about the full person instead of just the scientist. I think that can, that really helps people know that, like, okay, I am not my science 100%, I am all these other things. And also, being explicit about getting help, I think, is also is okay.
Absolutely.
It's important to foster that.
And so
dialogue.
I've had several students who've had that conversation, and they've let me know, and they're very successful students, and able to medicate and continue to do their work, and that's also true for some colleagues. So it's not just not only students, actually.
And knowing that this isn't an encumbrance.
No, it's not. It's not. And lots of people live very, very successfully.
And talk about chemistry, right? I mean, that medication for that is great.
Exactly.
Right?
There you go. Right.
Better through chemistry.
Yes, right. Better living. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
think I asked a lot of the questions I wanted to ask.
Okay.
Can we
okay.
end with any insights or closing remarks?
Yeah. So there's maybe a couple of things I want to talk about, which is that, we've talked about diversity and inclusivity, and I think, these are very, very important things. But often, a lot of people approach that with a little bit of caution, because often when you mention those words, people immediately equate it to either it's going to cost us money, or two, it's going to sacrifice excellence. Okay. And so those are two things that I actually think can be turned around and can actually become opportunities. So first of all, I think that there are lots of alumni in any institution that are committed to sort of diversity, and it can be used as a way to ultimately actually raise more alumni donations and funding. So it could be an opportunity to actually bring more resources to the table, as opposed to thinking it might sink resources away from the whole. And then the second part about a fear of sacrifice and excellence, I think, is also misconstrued, because I have many examples of excellence among diverse groups of people in terms of experiences, backgrounds, racial, and so forth. As many as I have excellent stories about people that perhaps are not viewed as underrepresented minorities. But I think that the opportunities to capture excellence are much more increased if you can be diverse in trying to capture the excellence in all different types of people, and not excellence in one particular type of people, because there's excellence across the board. And then as we discussed, that comes with lots of different perspectives as well, which can add to sort of your innate knowledge set that you need for a particular area, because perspectives can help answer questions and problems in different ways.
I want to thank Professor Sarpong again for joining us for this Faces of Science interview.
This whole setup is incredible, and
thank you.
You've been a great interviewer.
Yes, I try my best.
That's right. And I've enjoyed being in Evanston. The weather's beautiful. Everything's awesome.
Yeah, it's almost like Berkeley.
Well, yeah, it's actually, I would say right now, this is super perfect weather. Yeah, super perfect. Berkeley often has fog in the morning, even in the summer.
Yeah. You have to bring a jacket everywhere, right?
You do have to bring a jacket everywhere. We got the microclimate. So it's been really, really fun to be here over the last 2 days. So thank you again. This was really fun to be a part of. And I hope that there are more opportunities for us to have these types of conversations. And I think NUBonD is doing a great job of really capturing these moments, and I encourage other graduate students elsewhere to think about doing these types of things.
Yeah, for sure. Thank you very much.